Your textbook talks about three purposes of research: exploration, description, and explanation. While all three are important to the social research endeavor, we always want to be aiming for explanation, because explanation is what links us to theory, and that's how we get into truly rigorous social scientific research. To help us craft a really good research question, it actually can be really helpful to first take a step back and consider what is it that personally drives our research interest. Now, truly rigorous research should not be personally influenced, but a lot of times the questions we have do have a personal connection. And that's okay as a beginning point, as long as we work to overcome that to make it truly objective. How do we go about doing that? A good first step is to take some time to free write what is it that interests you in this project. So if you haven't done that, I mean really taken the time to write out some answers for yourself, I want you to pause the video now, set a timer for even 5 minutes, and just free write. What is it about this research topic that interests you? If you were guaranteed success, what would this project look like for you? Go ahead and pause, do some writing, come back when you're done with that. Okay, in my experience, most people have at least one of the following reasons that's undergirding their personal interest in their research topic. It could simply be curiosity. They've noticed some puzzle or oddity about the world and they want to understand it better. It could be that they have a problem they're trying to solve. This might be especially common if they're doing something related to a business they work with or some organization that they're a part of. Or it could be that they have a personal, political, or in some cases even financial stake in the matter. Now, I've listed all three of those reasons in order of increasing possible bias. And let's talk for a little bit about bias. Just because you're biased doesn't mean that you're wrong, but it does mean that you might need to hold your project up to a little bit closer scrutiny to make sure that your personal bias isn't translating into research bias. We are all biased in some form or another. That is just part of what it is to be human, and that's okay. But the task of the researcher is to become very aware of their personal bias and then take steps to ensure that personal bias doesn't influence the research endeavor. So how do we do that? Well, the first step is building off of what I just had you do a moment ago in the free writing. We need to become really clear about what our own personal bias looks like. Ask yourself questions like, what sort of outcome do I expect to find? And why do I expect to find that outcome? Generally, the bolder the claim, the more it needs to be interrogated. If you've ever interacted with a toddler, particularly a toddler in the why phase of development, it can be really annoying, but that is the sort of mentality that you need to develop. You need to ask yourself, why? Why? How come? How do I know that to be true? Constantly about every answer you come up with at this stage. This will help you to mitigate against the influence of bias in your research. Ask yourself, do I know this to be true, or do I believe this to be true? If you know it to be true, there will be evidence that you can look to that will back up that claim, and you will be able to see whether or not there is evidence that might refute your claim. That really is the ultimate purpose of doing research. Until we have proper evidence, we really only have beliefs about the world. Next, take your key concept of interest and consider all of the possible outcomes that could potentially exist. Now, this can be especially hard if you've already convinced yourself that you know what the outcome is going to look like. So for any possible answer you come up with, ask yourself the following counterfactual. How would I know if I was wrong? In other words, what evidence might you point to say, no, actually, that's not the case. It's something else. This links us back to how we conceptualize and operationalize those things that we want to research. What is it that we're using to show a particular phenomenon that exists in the social or political world? And so it means that we need to be really careful that we define in advance how we're going to measure certain outcomes. It's not that we define in advance what the outcome will be, it's that we become very clear about what evidence we are going to look to that will say, yes, this is occurring, no, this isn't occurring, or whatever appropriate answer set might fit for the question we're asking. But if we don't have our evidence defined clearly in advance, then it becomes a matter of, well, I know it when I see it, and that's just not good enough for quality scientific research. Finally, if possible, get an outside perspective, especially if you can find someone who has a lot less attachment to whatever your research topic is. Have you ever noticed how we often have a much easier time pointing out the biases and blinders of other people than we do for ourselves? That's normal, so use that to your advantage. We know that we're going to have a hard time seeing our own biases. Most of us have to work a lot harder at that, but maybe other people can see it for us. So ask someone else to critique your work, ideally someone who can lovingly and gently critique your work, to help point out where you might be wearing blinders and where you might be missing certain key pieces. If you do so, trust me, you will end up with a much better product in the end. Okay, now return to that free writing you did and see if you can identify what is your key concept of interest. What is that thing that you really want to explain? And for most of us, I would say about 90% of the time, the phenomenon that we initially write about for our research topic is the thing we want to explain. Very rarely, it might be the thing we think does the explaining for something else. If you think that's the case, feel free to reach out and we can talk more. But for most of us, the puzzle, the itch, the thing that drives us is there's this phenomenon that exists in the world, and we don't really understand why or how it works as it does. And that's what drives our research question. That's a great beginning point. We're going to use that as one of our main concepts as we develop our research question. What we need to think about, though, is what might help explain that particular phenomenon. If all we have is one concept of interest, we're going to be limited to descriptive and exploratory studies. Those are great. We do need exploration and we do need description in our work, but really good quality scientific research is going to go beyond those factors into explanation. And explanation requires at least one other phenomenon that helps explain the thing of interest. And so that gets us thinking about what are the key hallmarks of a good research question. There are 4 that we're going to talk through, and the first of those speaks directly to that very question of having multiple concepts of interest. A good research question proposes a possible set of relationships between or among concepts of interest. It tells us how one thing should or could or might relate to some other thing. So we might try to understand, for example, how the role of educational attainment influences earning potential. Or we might want to understand how gender influences some other phenomenon. And these are just some very simple examples that are things I often turn to in my own work. There are plenty of other things that you can turn to. But the idea is you must have at least 2 concepts, one of which is the thing you're really trying to explain, that intellectual itch that you've been working with. And the other is a thing that you think in some way helps explain that phenomenon. And it might be that there's multiple of those things. In the social and political world, usually it's not just one thing. We exist upon multiple interacting dimensions in our lives, and so it's very common there's going to be multiple things. There's also something to be said for sometimes you need to focus in on what are the things, or maybe the thing, that most matters in this case. Some things matter more in different circumstances than others. But the point is you're going to need to have at least 2 concepts, and your research question should in some way propose some possible relationship between them. The second major hallmark of a good research question is that understanding this relationship helps us to understand something about social or political life. Social scientists are sometimes accused of just being slow journalists, but that's really a disparagement. Journalism is really great. Journalism shows us the who, the what, the when, and the where. It's social scientific research that helps us to understand the why and the how. The theory, the explanation behind the phenomenon, that's what we're really driving at. And so as we're thinking about what is it about this relationship that we want to explain, we want to be linking that to how does this help us better understand something about the social or political world around us. The third key hallmark of a good quality research question is that it permits a range of possible answers. Really good research questions should be about more than simply a yes or a no. And they should definitely be about more than simply pointing to a particular desired or preferred outcome. That gets us back into the section on bias that we just talked about. A good research question allows for multiple possible avenues that could exist. It says many answers could be here, and we might know what we're going to see in advance, or we might have a good sense of what that could look like, but we could be wrong. And it leaves us open to being surprised in some way. It allows for possibilities that we hadn't considered yet to bubble to the surface somehow. Finally, a good research question advances a conversation in the scholarly world. Now, this last point is one that we're really not going to tackle much right now. If we had a little bit more time and space, and if we weren't meeting virtually, then we would be hammering at this more because I would have had you write a literature review where you would have gone into the academic literature to see what have other people written about this topic. You're not the first one to think of this, most likely. Other people have said things, and they probably have some pretty important things to say that matter to the kind of work you're doing that would shape the way that you frame your research project. Unfortunately, for the sake of time, we're skipping that part. And so as important as the research literature review is, we're not going to have that, which means we're not really going to be able to speak to those broader conversations in the academic community. But just know that if you go on to do other work, say in grad school or in some other capacity in your life, really, you want to be speaking to others. And it might not even necessarily just be other academics. Maybe your research question is driven by very practical matters. That's fine. You just want to make sure that your question is framed in such a way that it's not just speaking to yourself, that it can somehow speak to others who also have a relevant interest in this topic, whatever it may look like. Policy, research, business. There's all sorts of good answers there. Make sure your question is somehow relevant to them as well. Okay, truly last bit. Here are a few nuts and bolts that can help you craft a really good question. First, you ultimately want a question that is short and direct, but getting there is far from easy. Don't be afraid to write multiple drafts of your question. Usually the first question that I write on any research project I'm doing is long, it's clunky, it's convoluted, and it kind of only makes sense to me. And that's okay as long as I keep going to edit it and work it until it gets to something that is a good quality, direct and to the point research question. So write a first draft and let it be kind of messy. Give yourself permission to do that. Take a break from it and then come back to it and identify, what do I really mean here? How can I make this clearer? This is a great point to bring someone else in so that they can tell you what does and doesn't make sense. Related to that, remember that you want a question that is more than purely descriptive. Now, it may be fine to start with that. Maybe as you're getting going, particularly if you're still figuring out what your other concepts of interest are going to be, maybe you start by simply writing a descriptive question. So, what does this phenomenon look like? What could it look like? What are the range of possible answers that I might see here? That's a great place to begin. Then, as you start to think through what those possible answers could be, you need to start asking yourself, well, why would that be that way? Or, what would explain why it would be this way versus some other way? Or, what would explain if I saw the inverse of that? This is how you start to build to something that's more descriptive. So it's okay to begin there, but again, as with editing, make sure you're constantly building on that to improve it. The third thing that you might want to consider is how you begin your question. Good research questions typically begin with one of the 4 following words or phrases. They often begin with how, why, to what extent, or under what conditions. Now, beginning your question with one of these words or phrases doesn't guarantee that you're going to have a good research question. Sometimes you begin with that and it's really a faux research question. But typically, once you have a good quality one, you're going to have one of these words or phrases in there, and they're going to link to the other parts of those qualities of a good research question. Lastly, you want to ask the question, what is it that makes this research question puzzling? Is it puzzling in some way? And this links to that point about allowing a range of possible answers. What is that itch that you're trying to solve? And how does this question link back to that itch, but do so in a way that, again, permits a wide range of possibilities that could come forth? Now, this is not easy to do, and it doesn't happen all at once, but it is doable. So don't be afraid to let it take multiple iterations. Don't be afraid to let it take time. And don't be afraid to come to me for some feedback. I am happy to help you craft this. I will be able to help you a lot more if you come to me sooner rather than later. So begin on this now. It will take a little time, and over the course of the next few weeks, we will work on developing and crafting your research question into something that could truly be a zinger by the time you're done with this course.